citizens of Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago, which ideologically could provide a foundation for us to look inward at what it could take to arrive at lasting peace in Guyana. Tonight, we will have an equally enriching discussion under the theme Rights and Values. A reminder of our housekeeping protocols. We kindly ask that you take a moment to rename your device or Zoom name to reflect your full name and country. This helps us to keep track of participants, manage the discussion smoothly, and ensure everyone gets the most out of the webinar. If you're not sure how to do this, simply hover over your name in the participants list, click More, and select Rename. If you need any help, please feel free to message our support team in the chat. Kindly ensure that you keep your microphones on mute during the presentations or discussion to avoid the background noise. And of course, we know that you will have thoughts, questions, or even experiences that you may want to share with our presenters. We urge you to share those in the chat. There will be a designated time when the panelists will discuss the questions, and this is the question and answer segment. Of course, the session is being recorded, and a copy will be shared with participants afterward. If you experience any technical difficulties, please message our support team in the chat, and we will try our best to assist. At this point, let me remind you that the series is being organized by a core group of concerned Guyanese with support of the Roman Catholic Church in Guyana, building on the late Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which encourages the increased global use of political dialogue. I now invite Mr. Lawrence Lachman Singh, Governance and Conflict Prevention Professional, to open tonight's discussion.
Thanks, Vanessa, and good night, everyone. I'm actually representing Bishop Allen tonight since he had other pressing duties to attend to overseas. It's just really a few words of welcome to explain firstly why we thought this initiative was important. And it's really about promoting political dialogue in Guyana. Civil society has had a long and distinguished history in trying to work to deal with some of the threats to peace in Guyana, and usually that's been involved with something political like GUARD or EAB. There was the Social Partners. Even as recent as 2020, civil society came together to try and address the violence that erupted after the 2020 elections. Some people may want to know, well, what's the church got to do with this? Why is the church involved in politics? Well, we are actually of the view as Catholics that, God is everywhere. And whether we like it or not, even those we disagree with are all children of God, all created in the same image. So God is not somewhere out there in heaven, somewhere far away. We think God is actually here. And we should do our best to try and recognize that in the here and now. In fact, the late Pope Francis, as Vanessa mentioned just now, through the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, actually held out the hope that the world's most pressing issues like climate change and war could be addressed through political dialogue. So this is a contribution in that area that the church is happy to support. We actually, through this little group that Vanessa and I are a part of, saw the opportunity for key civil society and other stakeholders in Guyana to be re-energized and for them to recommit to the work that is needed for Guyana to achieve a just and lasting electoral peace through two things. One was learning from Suriname and Trinidad. Those two countries actually had elections this year, both of which were peaceful and both of which resulted in the political and peaceful transfer of power. But also learning through three topics that were derived from an earlier civil society dialogue, the one that I mentioned in 2020. And that's where we got the three topics for these three webinars from. including today's topic. So, finally, just to recap, we had the first webinar, which was on reconciliation and trust. And Bishop Francis has been in the forefront since 2014, calling for efforts to strengthen Guyana's history, to somehow deal with that in a way that reconciles us to the past and builds trust in the future. As well as the second webinar was on system strengthening, and then today, rights and values. So it's only left for me now to say thank you to all who have been involved, especially tonight, our moderator and two panelists. Thank you in advance for your sacrifice to be with us and your generosity to share your knowledge and expertise. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Vanessa. You're muted, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. And as Lawrence mentioned, over the past 2 weeks, we've had an interesting lineup of panelists, and that continues tonight. If you were with us last week, you would know that the discussion was, I think really, really interesting. And tonight, to lead us into another interesting discussion, we have our moderator, Miss Sharda Ganga. And Sharda is the director of Projector, an organization that works at the intersection of democracy, governance, and human rights with a special focus on gender equality and women's rights. She has years of experience with programs focused on civil society strengthening, advocacy, and dialogue processes. She is also a playwright, theater director, and newspaper columnist. So, Sharda, over to you. You're muted, Sharda.
I will unmute. So I said, thank you, Vanessa and Lawrence, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this very necessary series of webinars. And I'll just start off with, we already discussed that today we'll talk about, or tonight we'll focus on rights and values. And within a few days, Guyana is going into elections. And the hope, much like in all other countries, is for just electoral peace. Not simply elections without violence, but elections defined by fairness, justice, and respect for democracy. Elections that, if the voters so decide, end in a peaceful and democratic transition of power. But for that to happen, we all need to take up our play from the same rule book. We need to share the same values. Constitutional values are the principles enshrined in a nation's constitution. Things like democracy, the rule of law, equality, human rights, respect for diversity. They are the basic rules we all agree on. And they guide how citizens, communities, institutions, and leaders relate to and engage with one another, especially during and after elections. So for this third webinar, we are looking at this central question. What steps can be taken to strengthen a common understanding of constitutional values so that elections can be peaceful and result in peaceful and democratic transition of power? As with the previous webinars in this series, we are looking at Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname for lessons to be shared and learned. We have two panelists tonight. The first one is Lothar Bockstein. Lothar is a Surinamese national. He pursued his career and his education in the Netherlands, where he earned a Master of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Delft University of Technology. His professional journey began in Suriname, where he served as civil servant with the Ministry of Public Works. His involvement in the electoral process in Suriname has been very long and very noteworthy. From 1987 from 1987 to 1999, he held the position of chairman of the Independent Polling Authority of Suriname, OKB. He also served as the chair of the CHS, the Central Main Polling Station for Elections in Suriname, for 14 years. His expertise extended beyond national boundaries as he participated as an international electoral observer in multiple countries, including Paraguay, South Africa, Mozambique, Guyana, and Antigua and Barbuda. Since 2014, he has been an advisor for the Ministry of Home Affairs, continuing his dedicated service to the electoral process in Suriname. And we have as our other panelist, Wesley Gibbings, who is a Trinidadian journalist, author, media trainer, and press freedom advocate with over 4 decades of experience in the media industry. His career encompasses extensive work in print, broadcast, newswire, and online platforms, focusing on Caribbean public affairs and media development. He has been a pivotal figure in Caribbean journalism. He is the founding president of the Association of Caribbean Media Workers and has served multiple terms as president of the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Currently, he holds the position of vice president of the Media Institute of the Caribbean and serves on the governing council of the International Freedom of Expression Exchange and the steering committee of the Global Forum for Media Development. He has covered numerous elections and provided media training on coverage of elections throughout the Caribbean and in Fiji. Good evening, Wesley and Lothar again. Thank you and welcome. And we'll start off with our first block of questions, which centers around shared national and constitutional values. And the first question I want to pose is it fair to say that in Suriname and in Trinidad and Tobago, there is a strong sense of shared constitutional values? And if so, how does it manifest around and after election times? Are there factors that you can identify that sustain this shared sense of values or that weaken it? I don't know who wants to start. Wesley?
Okay, thank you very much. When I first saw the subject for the discussion and we had our talk a few days ago, I felt very insecure about engaging it because it's such a highly nuanced question and or sets of questions to respond to. When it comes to constitutional values, it makes things a lot more difficult for us as Caribbean people because we're essentially talking about a sort of legally expressed um, combination of values and principles to which everyone ought to subscribe. And I think that at the top tier, at the top level, where we talk about basic human rights and freedoms that's contained in all of our constitutions and in all three countries, um, that there are sub tiers that are perhaps, or sub levels that are perhaps equally important, if not more important. Because what happens is that when you speak about the principles and the values of constitutional measures or constitutional provisions, you need to break that down so that people have a clearer understanding of exactly what you mean. So that, for example, when you talk about the Constitution and elections, electoral democracy, representative democracy, there are many different views and levels of understanding of what would be the end product of those aspirations. And I think that's where we have the difficulty. Now, it's not by accident, of course, that we're talking about Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and Guyana, and perhaps the other panels would have discussed this, but I think we need to flag it at least in this conversation. Whereas there's this sense of geography and perhaps shared demography, but that's really quite an illusion. I think it's an illusion to consider that these countries on the question of constitutional values have occupied similar or the same status. So that would be my opening gambit on this, that it's a highly problematic question to engage. I have views of my own, which I plan to express later on, but that would be my opening statement on this.
So not a strong sense.
No, no. And I'll tell you, I think it's just a sheer reality, and it has been so since the 1960s and in the 80s in your case, where there were these expressions of values or principles or end products, if you want to put it that way. What would be the final outcome of our countries, the populations of our respective countries, agreeing to a way forward based on certain fixed principles? And what I'm saying is at the top tier, and you express some of it, a commitment to democracy. What do we mean by that? How is that expressed in our electoral systems? How is that expressed in the practice of politics? And I think it varies. There are similarities because there's something of a shared history. Sometimes that point can be overemphasized because at the very beginning, perhaps there are commonalities in terms of how we came here, how we all landed here, but there are things that have happened over the years that have rendered us, different creatures. I mean, we are the same people, but we live in different communities, and my neighborhood is different from your neighborhood, etc. And I think those are determinant factors in terms of framing how we see the eventual outcome of what is there via our constitution, via our various laws.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Lothar. Lothar.
Yes,
Your
I completely agree with Wesley. In
Wesley.
Suriname, we can say there is not a specifically a difference. We had the Suriname case 22 elections since the first one in 1949. And we had never had eruptions after the elections. So we could say that the parties adhere to the rules. That's the only conclusion we can draw. There is a lot to be said about elections and the organizations of political parties and how the leadership is. But when it comes to the result of the elections, they stick to the rules. And I can later explain that with two examples of elections where things changed after especially one where changed after the result was such, and after that it changed because movement of elected people elected in the parliament. That's my take on this.
So when I'm listening to the both of you, um, you're saying that in the case of Wesley, the definition of all of these values, democracy, what have you, that it differs among societies, and we still have to figure that out for ourselves in each of these countries. So, but at the same time, Lothar, you're saying, even though we may not agree on certain principles, we still in Suriname have stuck to the rules.
Yeah. Yes, that's what I see.
So we do play by the rule book.
Well, can I chime in, Shadow?
Yes,
because
go ahead.
Lothar raised a very, very interesting and very pertinent point, because I think it might be a mistake to point only to the question of the acceptability of electoral outcomes and to get down into what those electoral outcomes really mean. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have the first past the post Westminster system, representative system, where it is very possible for you to acquire 45%, 49% of the popular vote and occupy 2 or 3 seats in a 61 seat legislature. Now, okay, people say fine, but that was the rule. And there is general acceptance of this. In your case in Suriname, you have your own version of proportional representation, which is not the same as what exists in Guyana. And I know that there have been recent changes in Suriname. So Guyana has had more frequent outcomes that have not been universally accepted, but that's not only because of the process, but it has been, I think, because of an understanding or a requirement by electors that election outcomes or results ought to be a true reflection of how people really felt about those on offer. In our case in Trinidad and Tobago, it's even more extreme because you can have this huge mass of people who are saying, yes, we want this, we want this, we want this. And some of these things are pretty fundamental, because if you follow our elections since 1956 to now, you see that this whole question of values and what we consider to be important, what we consider to be critical in development, there has never really been a situation in which there is this kind of cohesive um, feeling that the elections have reflected how most of the people really feel.
The outcome or the elections themselves?
Yes, that's the outcome itself, but it's not because that, okay, so there's been general acceptance. We have never had, except in one instance where we had a 36-seat legislature and two parties won 18 each. And they had to find a way of negotiating that, which ended up being something quite unsatisfactory. But there has been general acceptance of the process and the outcome. I want to talk about the role of media in that because I feel very strongly that media performance plays a strong role in terms of general acceptability of electoral outcomes. But that's a sort of different.
We'll get into that later on when we look at the factors.
If I can say something, and because you have the system of first past the post in Trinidad, it is possible that people do not agree with the results. You gave an example at 49%, and still you get this. When you have proportional representation, which you have in Guyana and Suriname, you don't have this problem. In Suriname, we had proportional representation per district, and the districts were allotted some seats beforehand. Now with these elections, it has changed. We have proportional representation for the whole country. So what happened is that in the former system, Paramaribo, the district Paramaribo and Wanica, with 2/3 of the population, only had 24 seats of the 51. And that was, I think, anyhow, not enough. Now, where the system has changed, Paramaribo and Wanica contribute 2/3 of the seats because they have 2/3 of the population. So it has changed. But I must, and that was since the last election of May. But I must say also that the system has changed, but the result has not changed very much. 14 parties contested the election, 7 parties won seats. And of those 7 parties, only 1 is a new party, a new combination. 6 others were already in the assembly, and the people elected, they have not changed very much. So, but it is more it's fair, you can say it is a better system. But we say that maybe that's for the next part, but what should happen is that the proportional representation, or not, the administration of the resource, the districts and the resource we have in 64 resorts. That should change, because now they are only important to elect when necessary, the president and the vice president. And it must change, and we say it must, and you must have elections, not coinciding with the national elections. But anyhow, that's for the next part.
That's the resort, that's the local level government elections, which come into play for the election of president and vice president, when there's not a majority, a qualified majority in parliament for the election of the president and the vice president. Just to clarify, Wesley, you wanted to react very shortly, and then we go to the next.
No, not a very strong reaction. But again, Lothar has hit some very important nails on the head, because local representation is part of the aspiration. People are hoping when people go to a general election, they're also, in addition to the broad macroeconomic, etc., policy issues, want to make sure that their roads are in good, proper shape. And so the local component is very, very important. Now, the system that you have moved away from in Suriname, I'm absolutely no expert, but I was exposed to this some years ago doing election training in Suriname, and I had to have some knowledge of the constitution and so on. I think that it had the previous system had an effective basis for ensuring that local sentiments, not only local needs, a fixed role, whatever, but how important we feel we are. Where are we as Group A, Group B, in whatever region? How important are we? So there was this sort of emotional impact, which is not captured in our system in Trinidad and Tobago, because there's a very sharp distinction between local government and central government in Trinidad and Tobago. And there have been attempts, there was a process of local government reform that was engaged by the previous administration that went very far in terms of elevating local realities and local strategies for achieving development closer to the center. Now, what's going to happen to that now with the change of government, I'm not sure. But it would be really bad, I think, to move away from ensuring that people at the local level feel that what has happened, and people occupy our houses of assembly or parliament or whatever, represent how they feel about life and how they feel about their needs on the ground on a day-to-day basis. If you go to parliament and you debate a bill on money laundering or whatever the latest most fashionable issue is, that does not necessarily resonate right through. And to me, in a true representative democracy, you need to be able to reflect those needs.
Yeah. So what I'm taking away, Lothar, very last thing. Go ahead.
Very short. What
Wesley?
Wesley said, that is the ideal situation, but it never worked in Suriname. Never. So the change, and now MSC, that most political parties say, yes, they are going to change. They are going to introduce local elections, not and a better administration on a regional level. So we will wait.
We'll see. So this my takeaway from this very interesting and rich first question is that what you're both saying is that the fact that there's a peaceful transfer of power, and then there's on the surface of it, how do we say it, an acceptance of electoral outcome, does not mean automatically that there are shared values, constitutional values, and that what is needed first and foremost is to define common the shared values, to operationalize them, to implement them, to translate them, and into the lived realities of citizens and how it will impact their lives. Is that, if we talk about constitutional values, that's the gist of it. Right. I'm like, This is like a roller coaster. We'll steam on. So one of you touched very shortly upon, I think it was you, Wesley, um, upon the demographics of our countries, and and I just very shortly wanted to ask you and Lothar, how does our demographics, it's um, how does it come into play when we're striving for a common understanding of rights and values?
Okay, let me chime in. Lothar is the expert on this, but so I would have yielded to him if he had entered first. But let me say, yeah, the the fact of the matter is that our politics in all these three countries um, are reflected organizationally through ethnic expressions. Um, there's no getting away from it. That you have that. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people just throw that and say, well, oh, that's bad because what you have, um, uh, in our case, Indos, Africans, and different people from different backgrounds. There are people of mixed heritage, such as myself, and so on, where I mean, the people in my family and my immediate community have not really been a fixed ally of one or the other because we're known as the floating vote, right? Now, which is a kind of, depending on what your position is in life, you might see that as a negative sort of thing. I might see it as a positive thing. I think it's a positive thing because what's happening now as we develop as countries, I think that people are beginning to move away. If you look at the younger folk now and their political behavior, most of them are absenting themselves, which is sad, but it's instructive. We need to pay attention to that. Why are the under 30s not turning out to vote? Um, and part of the reason, maybe a small part, maybe a big part, somebody needs to study this thing, is the fact that the demographics have been so dominant over the years that as time goes on and our young people are exposed more and more to the world and how things work, they are moving away from that and they're not finding easy space,
Mm.
comfortable space in what exists. They are not going to align themselves with what we describe sometimes as tribalism. Now, as I said, I'm not totally dismissing tribalism because I'm not entirely a melting pot type. I think it's more toss salad type arrangement, even though that's problematic. But because there are implications for suggesting that you submerge yourself and into this bigger entity, which might not be your meal of choice. The meal of choice might not be a melting pot, a pilau or a cook up, right? It might be something completely. So the people looking at constitutions and these arrangements, I think, need to pay greater attention to that.
Okay, thank you. Keeping in mind that even in a cook-up, you can still find you can still identify the ingredients, right? In a good cook-up. So let's move over to the other cook-up, which is the role of political leadership. Um, so just even if you would have countries with strong national commitments to constitutional democracy, it doesn't mean that it will be strong and constant forever. So in moments of high political tension, especially during election, it will always be put under pressure. And then the role of political parties and leaders becomes crucial because they set the tone for whether values are upheld or undermined. So I think you would agree with that statement that they are the ones who set the tone. So in coming to you, Lothar, in past high stakes elections in Suriname and Trinidad, obviously for Wesley, have political parties and their leaders demonstrated or failed to demonstrate respect for constitutional values? And can you give specific examples? Lothar, take it away.
I think they have demonstrated that they adhere to the rules. The example is the election of 1996, where a combination of four parties won the elections. That combination won almost all the elections after the military period at the beginning. And what happened after the elections? One party of the four completely moved to the opposition, and a big chunk of another party, members elected in the parliament, also moved to the opposition. What happened is that the opposition became the coalition. They elected the president and the vice president, and uh, they made the government. But the party that won the election and then did not come in the government, they just took it and made no waves. And so it was more like, okay, that's what happened. So we cannot do much. And the election of the last election we had, 2025, as I said, 7 parties won elections, and 6 of those parties formed a government, and they have 2/3 majority. One party, and that party was of the ex-president. They are in the opposition now, and they also say it is like, okay, that's the situation. So they stick to the rules, and I think that is good. They must keep on doing that. That's it.
Yeah. Wesley.
Yeah. In our case, because the system is different. I mean, our constitution does not, for example, deal very tidily with coalition governments. We've had the experience of 1986, where you had something called the National Alliance for Reconstruction, which was really a composition of 3, perhaps 4 different political organizations. Yes, they did dissolve individual, but that was just a technical process, because when they went into government, they did express their own very peculiar demands, which led to the demise of that government eventually in 1991. Well, that followed a coup d'etat in 1990, and we can have an entire conversation about what really happened in 1990. I have some personal involvement in that, because at the time of the attack, I was covering Parliament when it was taken under siege. So there are interpretations of what really happened, which I continue to insist were not accurate. But that's another question. We can have a 1990 coup d'etat session that would last an entire day, and we've had a commission of inquiry on that. But we don't have very tidy arrangements regarding coalitions, coalition governments, which have, as Luther has suggested, both positive. There can be positives, because it can have the opportunity to keep whoever emerges as a leader in check, in terms of their political and other behavior, which was not the case in 1986 in Trinidad. And though it was the case by and large in 2010, 2015, when you had the UNC-led quote unquote partnership administration, which again, if you wanted to, we could spend some time discussing the extent that was in fact an illusion. And when we describe it as UNC dominated, I think that we can generally conclude that it was a UNC administration between 2010 and 2015. So the Constitution comes into play here, because there's not a very tidy arrangement. We do have a crossing of the floor act. So if the people decide, well, they're going to switch allegiances following an election, there is provision for recall of the MP. It's not properly regulated at the moment, but it can be invoked. Okay, but there's a sentiment. That's where I say the Constitution does not always address these things, these realities very tidily. And that has led to, in our case, a level of instability, uncertainty. The current administration, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, is nominally an alliance, um, known by different names, but that's an illusion. It's people look at it and they don't quite. It doesn't compute immediately that this is an amalgamation of different political interests. Now, I know in Guyana the constitutional arrangements do not necessarily or tidily cater for a post-election coalitions. So in instances, for example, where you had a minority government, that arrangement was subject to a kind of fluidity that played itself out when you had the 33, 32, what that itself did not um, we have people on the call here who can talk, very elaborately on that. But in my view, that was an instance in which, if we're focusing on constitutions here, the constitution really does not address that very, very tidily. And as a result, you had a lot of public dissatisfaction and so on, and a lot of very strong sentiments following the election that yielded the previous administration.
So I want to um, dive deeper into this, but from another perspective. But first of all, I just wanted to say to the participants, I don't know, I don't see any questions or remarks, and I just wanted to remind you that you can put your questions in the chat and we'll come to them later. So please, otherwise we feel so alone here. But Wesley and Lothar, I see that listening to you, you're focusing on the process after the elections when we talk about respect for constitutional values and the role of politicians and of political leaders. So if we leave that behind, because you both focused on the way they handled the outcome, and if that was in line with respect for constitutional values, but just the overall, very quickly, the overall process of elections, which of course a whole other bunch of constitutional values and democratic values come into play. So with that, in that sense, would you say that they demonstrate or fail to demonstrate respect for constitutional values?
And I start, and we have not seen that in Suriname. When you're in the process of the election, it is just more or less, when I see a carnival in Suriname. They promise a lot, and that's it. The political parties have no we say vision or socialist or whatsoever. They promise, and when they are in the government, you must hope that they do what they promise. And the organization of the election, that is where in Suriname it is done by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and that's it goes well. They do what they should do. The specific things like a voters list and so on, they're standard, and people can check if they are on the list and so on. The problems are with the candidates. When you make a candidates list, and the last election again, that's when something is wrong on the list, the party can go in appeal. With the appeal is the president, and the president is represent a political party. But even though that is the case, it still works out. But these are the things that we should change also in Suriname.
Wesley.
Yeah, I think that process is very, very important. And I'm not 100% sure about process in Suriname, but from my from my passing knowledge of it, I think it's a pretty sound system. The systems are pretty sound. Guyana as well, notwithstanding the political dialogues, I think by and large, the processes are relatively sound. Trinidad and Tobago is pretty sound. We all have relatively acceptable processes for determining the electoral lists.
Mm.
In Trinidad and Tobago, there's continuous registration. So there is the opportunity to get people there. There will always, in every single context. I was observer at an election in Sierra Leone in 2023. And that, if you want to find what is a problematic process for ensuring that people have the right to vote, that existed then. And I think that voter education was very, very important. And the lesson from that is that you can have these pretty sound processes. Doing, I think, the tabulation of the outcomes and the voting, there can be some work on that. In Guyana, I know that's an issue. One of the observer missions at the last election had recommended, for example, the system of electronic transfer of outcomes in the the outreaches, the districts out outside of Georgetown, and that was never taken on board. But I think that it is very important that the systems are sound, that they're honored, and that there is an electoral body, and the composition of the electoral body in Guyana, for example, is completely different to what we have in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm not sure what obtains in Suriname, but in Trinidad and Tobago, we don't have party representation on our electoral commission or electoral board. So I think process is very, very important, because that is what will make the difference. So even though you have an efficient process for ensuring electors are registered, ensuring that when they get to the voting centers, they are facilitated and they're able to vote. And then when you have the counting, that counting takes place, it's based on very sound principles. And then when you have the declaration, the preliminary results, and so on, that all those processes. And we have, I think on paper, we have them.
So that's the thing, is that listening to you would say, wow, what great democracy and what great political leaders these two countries have, that not that even during election times and even during their how do you say, their campaigning, they're always adhering and keeping in mind I'm the sound electoral and constitutional values, and that they're so very fair and keep at the front of their minds all these values of equality and rule of law, etc. So listening to you too, I'm just trying to
Yeah, that's I noticed that.
so
It is far
I
far
hope
from that in the campaign.
yeah.
When they campaign, they seems to forget those things, and
So this is
they promise a lot of things, and sometimes they play the ethnical the ethnicity string. But after the elections, all fades away. So it is just during the election that they do this, they stir this thing up.
I understand, but and this is really my last question on this, and then we'll quickly go to the last one, is that even during the elections, uh, um, when they use this type of technique, how do you say it, tactics, they undermine values, they undermine principles, right? So it's not a question just of looking of how the system holds and if everybody plays by those rules. It's also the behavior during campaigns that undermines the principles. Quick word from you both as a reaction, very
I think
quick.
no, there's a very strong role for civil society here. Independent voices chiming in and sort of bringing a level of balance to what is being said on the campaign trail. Because as we know, people say all kinds of things on the campaign trail when they're canvassing, and many things remain unattended to when they ascend to office.
Yeah. I'll go to the last bit because that's actually a good introduction you're giving, Wesley, is that um, you're talking about the role of civil society in correcting what goes wrong, to voice the wrongdoings and to bring everybody back to where they should be. So one thing that we should look at is how do you build shared constitutional values? Because throughout this whole conversation, it has become clear that either also in Suriname and Trinidad, we still have a very long road to go. So these values take root. For these values to take root and to endure, they must be shared, they must be reinforced, and they must be lived across society. So, very quickly, what is needed to ensure that citizens, communities, and institutions develop, understand, and internalize these principles and put them into action? Who should do what?
Can I will start. And this question is, who likes to see things change? I think not the political parties. They like it as it is. It is it is the it is we the avant-garde that say something must change. And the question is how you get this change. That is the big question. And we say the education, permanent education, the younger one seems not to be interested in politics. That's what it looks like. And the young ones that are in the political parties, they are just a copy of the old ones. So 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 civil society has a big role to play, and it is a permanent role, a permanent education of the voters. You must not expect that the established political parties will do that because they like it as it is. That's my point.
Wesley, focusing on Trinidad, what, who should do what?
I think that everybody plays a part. They already play a part, but some elements of the society need to play a greater role. I think that independent civil society, and I'm qualify civil society by adding that independent, because what happens a lot is that you can purchase civil society arrangements through state largesse, etc.
Mhm.
Through whatever process there is for registering them. And I know in certain parts of the Caribbean, that's a live issue right now, which we don't need to get into, but that's part of the thing. The extent to which we're really dealing with independent bodies that are capable of standing away from those particular sentiments and making an assessment of what is actually happening. I think that needs to be enhanced. The political parties will play their role. Now, I remember at one time back in 1980s when people were pretty enchanted at what happened in 1986. They were talking about the political parties operating political schools. Eastern Europe, back in the day, you could not stand as an elected representative unless you had completed political education under the sponsorship of your party. That's all socialist thing, whatever. But I think it was a good principle because what you're really doing is you're building a cadre of people capable of elevating political issues beyond the banalities of race and specified interests so that you have a kind of a growing independence. But there is a strong role right now, I believe, for good, solid civil society organizations. We don't, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago have a fully functioning and effective human rights body. We do these things in bits and pieces. I follow freedom of expression and press freedom, through my work with the International Freedom of Expression and so on. But there's a lot of work the LGBTQI community has become more vocal, and they're perhaps the most visible and arguably most effective group in terms of educating people and spreading the message. So I think civil society, independent civil society, has a very, very strong role to play, which they are not currently, it's a mandate they are not currently fulfilling.
Thank you. Thank you, Lothar. Thank you, Wesley. Um, it's a very sobering last comment for the panel round. Um, and I have to say, I totally agree. I mean, knowing a bit about the situation in the Caribbean and of course Suriname very well, but also Trinidad and other countries, it is true. It is so very true. So we'll get to the part where we'll look at the questions from the participants. And the first question is, Suriname has an interesting phenomenon of coalitions, which are a great way of fostering political cooperation. This is for you, Lothar. Do these coalitions produce improved governance? What are the values, traditions, and mindsets that encourage parties in Suriname to seek alliances with other parties?
Well, I don't want to be too. Let's put it this: don't put your hopes too high, because the coalition in Suriname, when the elections result is there, the first thing they do is look for parties to come together, and then they talk about who gets which ministries and other political positions. They don't even talk about the government issues and so on. That comes later on, and it's the question if they stick to the things they say. We expect that in October, when the government will do present their vision for the next years, we could see some things. But the parties up until now just do their own things. They are in a ministry, and the whole ministry reflects that party. And I must say that this president say things will change, and we are hopefully that it will will realize. But up until now, the coalition was only made on interest of the parties, who gets what, and which ministry. A ministry of natural resources is one they fight for. Public works is one they fight for. You know, those are the big ministries. But let's say the vision for the future, and so that does
And
not come out.
yeah. And I always say nobody fights for the Ministry of Education.
Education, yes, that's true.
So I see a question from Vanessa Williams, who is asking, would you agree that social experiences shape value creation at the level of the local community? And how do we energize local persons around demanding value from parties pre and post elections? So,
Yeah.
Wesley.
I mean, if I understand the point about local communities, I'm assuming you talk about local geographical communities. I think that in the Caribbean, we need to sort of reformulate this notion of local
Yeah.
and what we actually mean by communities, because I think what's emergent, particularly among the younger set, that we have communities of interest that are at times much stronger than geographical communities. So there are young people who are rallying behind particular issues and particular causes, and they're not from the same place. And in many instances, they're not even from the same sort of backgrounds. But it's a very valid point to consider how you can mobilize and energize these communities of interest, and which is my preferred approach to it, in the direction of ensuring that electoral processes remain sound,
Mm.
that people become engaged, because the young people, as I said, are disengaging. And that kind of work needs to take place both at the formal and informal levels. It needs to take place through their education system. And I'm glad Sharda raised a point about education, because that's, if it doesn't happen there, if the seeds aren't planted there, then you're going to have great difficulty in terms of fertilizing it and making it grow and making it meaningful to people in their various communities, whether geographical or in terms of communities of interest. So yes, values are shaped and created through communities. And the way to achieve that, one, I think, would be to ensure that the system of education you have addresses that in a very real way. There are too many instances in which people come through the school system and they don't understand the processes. You talk about the democratic process, you talk about uh, elections, you talk about representative politics, and they don't understand what you're talking about. But you need to do that, and you also need to do that through the intervention of strong, independent civil society organizations.
So I have two questions here. Um, and I'll go to David's question because you ended on the note of civil society. David Singh is asking, it's very easy to say civil society has a role, but what does this really mean within the context of electoral process? Wesley, go ahead.
One, I think that civil society organizations need to play an educational role so that people understand. In addition to, of course, it is true the electoral bodies do conduct a level of public awareness and public education, but that needs to be reinforced by people who are not seen as having a horse in the race,
Mm,
or there's not a perception. So the political parties do that, but they always screw that up by inserting their own particular interests and their own interpretation of what's happening. But it's important, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it, they should do it. But you need independent civil society organizations that are providing that level of education in terms of what is engaged, what is involved when you engage the process of elections. They need as well to ensure that there's information available on the outcomes. I mean, that their responses to what the outcomes are not partisan, are not purely partisan in value.
mm,
So you have these outcomes, and I know David knows the Guyana situation, and there is an uproar about, and then when you look at it very closely, you will see that the process does cater for inconclusive outcomes in some instances, in
yeah,
some specific areas. But so somebody to say, hey, wait.
but you
This
see,
is what the process calls for.
yeah. I'm going to take off my moderator's hat and go into discussion just for a tiny bit. Um, you see, because I've heard you you both talking about the role of civil society, but it very much comes down a bit to voter education and to etc. But you see, in the broader context of independent civil society and in the broader context of citizenship, that is not enough. That is not enough. And I do think we should have a broader conversation about what civil society really is and what its role really is, because it's also about political education of citizens, because that's the true meat on the bones. And now I'll go back to being the moderator. I just wanted to drop that penny there and go to the next question for Lothar. Lothar, this is from Colin Cloutkey. And I think I know Colin. For the Surinamese representative, that's Lothar, Guyana's first peoples as a rule, are in need of voter education. And it seems an educated indigenous population on elections issues generally are seen as undesirable by successive Guyana governors. Would you say that Suriname's comparatively large native population benefits from adequate voter education? Uh,
Um, the figures, the indigenous population in Guyana is 10 or 11%. In Suriname, it's not even 6%. So I think the indigenous population in Guyana has a much bigger role to play than in Suriname. That's my take here. It is they are scattered, they are small. The indigenous people, and don't mix it with the Maroons. The Maroons are 26% of the populations, and the East Indian, we say Hindustanan, are also 26% of the population. But the Amerindians, the indigenous people, is only 6%. And they have small communities, and as I say, they are scattered around the country. But I think, as I said earlier, that the indigenous people of Guyana will have a bigger role to play. I can see it when I watch Guyana. I follow Guyana daily. You can see that.
but his question is about he said, would you say that Suriname's I'll leave the part of the large, how do we say it, of the percentage out. He said he's asking, would you say that Suriname's native population, that the indigenous population benefits from adequate voter education?
No. The voter education, and that goes for the whole country, is not optimal. But especially for the interior, the education is there is no focus on the education. That is one big thing. The last election, I even, because there was not enough money, I told them you should do it. You see, they do a lot of voter education, and they do it for the coastal area where everybody has a telephone. And I say you must go in the interior and do the voter education. But what happened? Because the number is so small, the political parties, they don't worry, especially now with the national representation. The votes of the people in the interior, they are expensive. You have to pay for the transport and so on. So they tend not to spend so much time on
Know
that.
that they are worth less in terms of the
Yeah,
value of the vote.
of course.
Yeah. There's a question here from Mr. Alfred Bulai. He says, Mr. Boxstein identified the problem of getting the political representational system changed. Have these discourses produced a practical way of getting that done peacefully in Guyana? Oh, I don't know who this question is for, Mr. Bulai. What discourses? Is there anybody who wants to answer?
Yeah, I
Leslie?
wouldn't say I'm in a position to respond to that.
No, me neither. But perhaps yeah. Well, the political representational system was changed due to Lothar, how do you say it? That was through
Senate citizen took the
yeah,
initiative.
the initiative and the constitutional court.
Yeah,
etc. So it went like that because it
yeah. It was not the initiative of political parties.
of another initiative and etc. There was a lot of talk about it, but because it demanded a change of the constitution,
Of course.
we had to wait until there was a constitutional court, and which came into being about 3-4 years ago. So, Mr. Bula, if I didn't understand your question correctly, please explain it or address it. Tell me who to address it to. I have this one, that.
Let me say, there might be something to say about the proportional representation discussion in Trinidad and Tobago, because we have had successive constitution reform commissions with consultations, and there has always been very strong representation on that issue. In fact, the late former Prime Minister Bassey Pandey was a strong advocate for it, though he never drilled it down to say exactly what he meant, because we're talking Suriname and Guyana, and those are two different systems and two different ways of doing it. And I don't think that in our case we ever entered that deeply into the matter.
There's a question here from Monique Esset. She says, it's been demonstrated that in Suriname, the parties don't take the presentation of their proposed programs and policies very serious. So they are often political promises not supported by financial projections and timelines to be realized. And her question is, how is this in Guyana and Trinidad? But let's focus on Trinidad because we don't have a Guyanese panelist. But how is this in Trinidad, Wesley? And how can we address this better? So the address this better part will go to Lothar. But how is this about the party programming in Trinidad? Is it taken more seriously, Wesley?
I think over the years, yes, because what you have are political parties that produce pretty elaborate campaign manifestos with all kinds of very specific suggestions in them. There, there's usually an absence of priority of where do the priorities lie and what are the implications. So though they throw these things out that these are things that should be done, and I don't think that there has been a situation in which these things are fleshed out properly, because they're just throwing 30 promises, 40 promises at you. And then when they come to power, Trinidad and Tobago, we are going through this right now, where there were certain things that were suggested, proposed in the campaign that were that are being implemented that are not really finding huge political favor. And that's because the issues were never really fleshed out. They were thrown out basically as public relations and things to attract support, as opposed to boiling it down. And that's again where you need independent voices in the media and elsewhere, basically asking the questions about the suggestions that are made. So I'd say that in terms of meeting the campaign promises are relatively clear, but they're very superficial, and that they are not drilled down enough. There are things that are absent. For example, I always make the point about political parties. They don't put issues like capital punishment, for example, which the human rights folks like myself, we are opposed to the capital punishment. And I would prefer to see a campaign manifesto say, listen, this is how we are authoritatively going to deal with it. And it just emerges. LGBTQI rights, for example, as part of freedom of expression and as part of the universality of human rights, those things are never really put squarely and in detail on the table. So a political party makes promises. It may or may not allude to that, but when they come into power, you see that there's nothing done about it. There's no conclusion.
Yeah.
Uh,
Lothar.
because what Wesley said, the same goes for Suriname. They promise a lot. There is no timeline. There is and no budget when you want to do what. I must say that civil society, the organization of economists in Suriname, they try to get the political parties in a discussion before the election. But I think that after the elections, one part of the job of civil society could be to hold the political parties to the promises they have made. He said, you have said this, you would do it. When will you do it, and how, with which money? Then we can, then maybe in the future things will change. But up until now, it is just promises and so on.
I just want to tell the audience, again, taking off my moderator's hat, is that I'm part of a civil society group that's called the Citizens Initiative for Participation and Good Governance. And over the past 3 elections, we've done this very, 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 how do you say it? This huge task of comparing all electoral manifestos. And we do have a system of policy monitoring afterwards, in order to look at who's doing what. But you see, Wesley, and Lothar, in the last election, about 75% of the parties didn't even acknowledge the existence of women in their in their party platform. So that's just an anecdote. There's one question at the top of the pile that I missed from Mr. Ali Majid. This is for Lothar. Suriname recently modified the PR system. Can you say how many modifications you had prior to this year?
We had no modifications. So the system was designed or started in after the military period. It started the first election with a district proportional was in 1987, and then only now the election of 25 it changed. There were no changes in between.
Okay, David is asking, is civic education part of the curriculum in schools in Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago? And if yes, does it include education on electoral processes and democracy?
If I start, I think it is, I have no children at school anymore, but I think there is a part like maatschappijleren or something. But I don't think that political education is part of it. No.
Yeah, well, you do have a social studies component under the Caribbean examination system.
Yeah.
So yes, there is that, and I think in a very vague way you have this thing about elections and democracy and so on. But I operate a little distance away from the education system. But my general reading is that it does not really get down into that enough. And also, it's not associated readily with an examination of society, how our societies have evolved, and why we have the systems that we do, and what are the things that can be done to make it better. I think that's important. I think it should be on the education system. We recently went through Emancipation Day in Trinidad and Tobago, and I think that the level of discourse on that was a reflection of the fact that there is no sort of formal introduction to these things in that kind of way.
Yeah. So I see one last question. Let me have a quick look. David will help me. Civic education, Mr. Vaccine. I think I've addressed them all. I see one last question. That's from Lawrence. Lawrence is asking me, where does my civil society coalition get funding and other resources to do that civic education work? A very interesting question. We once had a grant from the EU. I think about, my colleagues are on this call. I think about 10 or 12 years ago, we had a small funding from the EU, and we set up this citizens initiative with that funding. And it's been going on since then with no funding, but a group of volunteers. But I can't say no funding because it's being funded, self-funded by Proyecta. I'm the director of Proyecta. So, and we do self-funding, through our other work, and we do fundraising here and there. But we're quite creative, and the main thing is a dedicated group of people who don't like to sleep. So it continues like that. Sometimes we're very, very active. Sometimes we're a bit less active, but when push comes to shove, we're there. So, but we will definitely, we can talk about that some more after this series. Um, and then because I see we still have 3 minutes left, and I'll end with a question to Lothar and Wesley very quickly. Looking ahead, right? What are for you the three priorities to ensure that future elections in our regions are not only peaceful, but truly embody just electoral peace? Elections that are fair, just, and respectful of democratic principles, and that strengthen trust in democracy.
I start.
See,
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead, Lothar.
Okay. I said for Suriname, I have one priority, and that is establish an independent electoral body, because we don't have that, even though elections are going good. It is the Ministry of Interior Affairs that is responsible for the election. That is very important, and I must say that political parties that are in the government see that they are willing to change things. That's positive. And the other thing is, I also talked about already, reorganize uh, uh, the local administration and have separate local elections. And then another point I have, established rules for democracy in the political parties. Because the political parties, you can say, start by having secret voting in the political parties, accountability for the parties, especially for the finances, and capping of the donors, because that is a very big problem,
Yeah,
I think, in most of the countries.
yeah. And Wesley.
okay, my 10 would be, okay, not 10. I'll just give you a few. I think that there needs to be greater integration of local issues and local dynamics in the general election sphere. How that is represented in detail, I think that's for the country to determine. I think there needs to be a greater role, for formal role for independent civil society, together with an activation of what Lloyd Bess, Trinidad and Tobago thinker, used to call the political, the validating elites of our society. That we need the validating elites. These would be the intellectuals, the public intellectuals. These were the people who um, citizens listen to and who can rely on. That does not work in Trinidad and Tobago. That's a complete mess. What you see represented as independent professional opinion is so heavily partisan flavored that the thing, I mean, there's just a loss of credibility when it comes to dealing with a lot of the public intellectuals in particular. And I think finally, there needs to be a way of embracing the youth. The young people need to be brought more into the process to feel that they belong there. They play a greater role than waving flags and singing on the stage and handing out pamphlets house to house. I think they are the future. As our private conversation before, Sharda, I said that I'm no believer in any lost generation thing when it comes. I have great hope for the future, but we need to step out of the way. We are standing in their way, and our societies need to step out of the way and allow them to enter the public space.
Thank you, Wesley, and thank you, Lothar, for this very rich discussion. And we're ending on, I think, very valuable notes about internal democracy of parties, because, if it doesn't start there, um, if you're not democratic in your own party, how will you project that on the national stage? Internal democracy, the need to bring local and national elections and issues together, independent electoral bodies. The youth is the way forward, and the need um, for a more formal role of independent civil society, and to be aware of the laws of validating elites, because that is, if you lose that, what things fall down, things fall apart. To end on that note, thank you, and I'm giving the mic back to Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Sharda. Thank you so much, team. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we thank you to our panelists tonight, Mr. Lothar Bockstein, Mr. Wesley Gibbons, and of course, our moderator, Sharda Ganga, who led us through the discussions, as well as our previous panelists for sharing their experiences with us. We also wish to thank all of you who have joined us over the past weeks. Without you, these discussions would not have been as enriching as they were. As we leave this space and bring our webinar series to a close, we hope that the discussions really have lit a fire within you to continue to question how it is that Guyana might be able to achieve just electoral peace. Over the course of 3 weeks, we have, as you would have heard earlier tonight, discussed topics such as reconciliation and trust, system strengthening, and tonight we ended on rules, rights, and values. I believe that over the course of this discussion tonight, we've heard a couple of key things. One of the recurring theme, I believe, would have been the role of education and the role of civil society. But as we delved into rights and values, something that I think we should take away is our own role in demanding those rights, demanding the values of the political actors within our individual spaces. We heard from our panelists about the role of parties adhering to rules, leadership rules, and peaceful elections. We also heard about those various definitions of values amongst our societies and how we figure out what those values are within our societies. I hope that throughout all of this discussion, that we are able to work together, come together to move Guyana forward, whether we move the discussion forward as independent civil society or whether we do this collectively as a nation. I believe that we all have a role to play, and we want to thank you all for finding this discussion to be of some value, that you have spent the last 3 weeks here with us. So with that, on behalf of the organizing team, I wish to say thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.